Hello there, and welcome back to the channel.
Hey, my name's Taffi. Oh.
A few moments later.
Where am I? Wait, who are you?
I can't remember at this point. It's been so long.
Oh, sorry, I guess. Anyways, what are we doing here?
Great question. I brought you gentlemen here. As if declining media literacy...
What was he saying?
I don't know, he's been practicing that for the past hour.
...wasn't enough, I run into you two, continuing to fight the good fight.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, who even are you? Why did you bring us here?
I'm Max, director of the Nerd Desk, and I'm here to talk to you about the Guardians of the Galaxy Retrospective.
Interesting.
With a brand we love struggling to stay afloat these days, why not reflect on a chunk of their catalog that had a better run than some of the others?
And you want us to do it?
Yes, I can't do it alone, and you two stood out from the others, so you guys up for a collab?
This is kind of like that One Tech 9 song, right? Worldwide Choppers?
Exactly like Worldwide Choppers. That's right, everyone. Today, I've enlisted two fellow YouTubers to cover all the Guardians of the Galaxy projects. Typically, all of the Marvel trilogies and now quadrilogies have a black sheep of some sort that is generally considered to be worse than the rest, but Guardians doesn't really have that problem, with the main entries ranging from great to good/great to heartbreaking. And on top of that, there's also a decent amount of side stuff too. However, the video games and the I Am Groot shorts won't be discussed, but I will acknowledge the very well done characters in both of the games. I've heard nothing but great things about the gameplay and how the character work was executed. For as much as I love Marvel, which has become increasingly obvious lately, I know, I can't be ignorant to the fact that so many of these movies, some even before Endgame, feel like they were made as a product, meant to pull you into a theater, and at the end, entice you with more to make you watch the next movie, and the next, and the next, and then it was done with TV shows too. But these movies don't feel like slop that you hear about on social media and eventually watch on a plane a year later.
A level 4 naughty lister?
They're pieces of art, James Gunn's magnum opus. Anyways, I'm very excited to talk about these things and to show you what these guys have on offer. So with all that being said, let's begin with... Okay, Taffi, you're starting us off. Don't mess this up.
Okay. Hey, my name's Taffi, and I'm struggling to cope with the fact that this year, James Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy will be 11 years old. This movie for me was the MCU's true turning point, and it showed us how powerful superhero movies could be, as it was able to skyrocket the popularity of one of Marvel's D-list teams. Like, seriously, the Guardians were a pretty niche group, to the point where Star-Lord got a completely new wardrobe, and Drax changed skin tones without being cancelled. Because this movie has been out for so long, and I was still failing my spelling tests when it first came out, it's hard for me to believe that there was a time where the Guardians of the Galaxy weren't in the mainstream or so many people's favorite superheroes. I mean, damn, do you know how many times I used to see that awesome Mix Volume 1 image going around? Or how many people were obsessed with Groot's vocabulary being "I am Groot"? I know, because I was one of those people. The Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy is possibly the best trilogy in the MCU, and although the other films in the series are amazing, I've always been more attached to the first one. And I'm about to tell you what I love about this movie, and some things that aren't so great so I don't end up just completely glazing it. This movie's plot portrays powerful themes of confrontation and found family. Throughout this movie, the Guardians will have to struggle with either physically or metaphorically running away from something, and the final act is when they finally confront these things that are chasing them head on, even if it hurts like hell. Peter Quill runs from dealing with grief and is pretty much a man-child for the majority of the movie. Gamora runs from Thanos because although she was brought up in an environment where she very much could have ended up like the other children of Thanos, she holds on to her strong morals. Drax runs away from living a life for himself and is a slave to vengeance, and Rocket runs away from the fact that regardless of how or why he was created, he deserves better than to live in a state of self-hatred. And Groot? Well, actually, Groot's kind of just enjoying the company, I'm not gonna lie. And when you add this to the fact that this movie has some of the best gags in Marvel movies, period, is one of the reasons why I think this movie is such a standout in the MCU lineup. There's this quote by Joss Whedon, director of the first two Avengers movies, and this. I recently saw this, and although it's easy to make a meme out of it, I think that Guardians of the Galaxy exceeds Joss Whedon's superhero films because it knows how and when to distinguish the comedic moments from the tragic ones. The funny scenes are extremely funny, and the sad scenes are extremely sad, but they never get mixed to take away from the emotion emotion that the movie wants you to feel at that specific moment. The scene where Yondu starts spurting gibberish to the pawn shop owner while Sean Gunn breaks character, it always gets a laugh out of me every time I watch it. Rocket's sick sense of humor and stealing prosthetic body parts is only funny because you can see how hilarious he thinks it is, even if it's extremely messed up. But when you're least expecting it, the movie punches you in the gut with scenes like the one where Rocket almost shoots Drax. In this scene, he pours out his heart, explaining how he lives in ridicule just for existing and being the way he is, and that he didn't ask or want to be made like this. And then there's the scene where Quill finally opens the gift and letter from his mother, or Groot's sacrifice, bringing Rocket and the entire audience to tears. I mean, it's brilliant. The way I can really sum up Joss Whedon's quote is by this. Imagine when Peter Quill opened up Awesome Mix Volume 2, put it in his tape deck, and instead of playing this,
Ain't no mountain high, ain't no valley low.
it played this. I've seen a lot of people talk about how the Power Stone scene is a representation about the shared pain that all the Guardians have, and I completely agree with this view. This scene encapsulates them confronting their struggles, and even though it causes them excruciating pain, they're facing their pain together. Of course, they don't end up solving all their problems at the end of this single 2-hour movie, but in Guardians 1, they learn to open up to people and finally find a family through their shared pain. Even though they did try and kill each other a couple times throughout the movie, but just forget that happened. And although they became the heroes that saved Xandar, they'll still have a lot more events to go through. As you can see, I really like this movie. But I do have one complaint with it. Ronan. Ronan is not the greatest villain, mainly because he's a one-dimensional genocidal war leader. The movie focuses so much on the protagonists that they leave only so much space for Ronan's character to be fleshed out. We know he's killed many under Thanos, including Drax's family, and that he wants revenge for the genocide committed against the Kree, so he turns on his boss to fulfill his desire to destroy Xandar. But other than this, there's no other side to him. It's not that I think that villains can't be written as completely evil, but even Thanos in the movies is written really well and also has plans to commit mass genocide. I also don't think the villain has to have a super personal connection with the main character either. They can like not know each other and still have a good dynamic, but Ronan falls short of that. And that's why I don't think you'll hear many people say that Ronan is in their top 5 MCU villains list. To me, he barely scrapes the qualifications of being considered a character and is more of a plot device, but that's my only real complaint of the movie. And then do I even need to mention the soundtrack? It's awesome. I would play it, but I'm sure Desk wouldn't appreciate the slap in the face YouTube content ID would give to this video if I did. But it uses pop songs as a narrative device that fits in with the certain scenes of the movie as great background music and diegetic sound as well. I'll use the Flash movie as an example since that movie used a lot of licensed pop music throughout its runtime. Whilst it wasn't a bad addition to that film, it kind of felt like the writers just wanted to put their favorite songs in the movie just because they could. But in Guardians, each song is placed where it needs to be because it adds more depth to the scene by reflecting the character's feelings, and also it makes more of a connection between Peter and his mom as she would share her favorite pop songs with him, most of them being about love. In terms of visual effects and CGI, MCU movies have been getting their names dragged through the mud for years. I've heard it all. They're just 2 hours of glorified previs that use as many green screens as humanly possible. It's not a new thing to complain about, but to this day, Guardians is one of the best looking movies in the whole MCU dynasty, and it's a damn sci-fi movie, meaning it will be full of visual effects. The whole movie is set in these beautiful fictional worlds and galaxies, and there are so many shots and character designs that just make me foam at the mouth. I will never envy the number of hours that actors like Karen Gillan, Zoe Saldana, and Batista had to sit in to prepare the makeup and wardrobe, let alone shoot for long hours whilst fully being covered in all that stuff. Shout out to the extras as well, because there are a lot of cool costumes that they had to get put in, and some of them were just straight up pink and yellow. Sean Gunn killed it as expected. He's a master at using body language both extravagantly and minimally, so it's no surprise that they got him to play Rocket and even the Weasel in Suicide Squad. I'm happy that they gave him his own character too, because even the small little things that he would do, like punching Drax in the arm in a friendly manner, only to be terrified by Drax's look back at him, brilliant. The cinematography is beautiful as well. Ben Davis and his team crafted so many beautiful shots that are stuck in my head to this day, and the VFX team balled out when making these shots feel real. The iconic scene where Groot illuminates the cocoon has been glazed to the point of no return, and justifiably so. It's one of the most magical scenes in the movie, and it's mostly made up of CGI. It makes me sad that the term CGI has pretty negative connotations surrounding it right now. Whilst I do love when practical sets and effects are used in sci-fi movies, especially like how it was used in the original Star Wars trilogy, I would be lying if I didn't say that I also love CG. I mean, look at me. I'm a cardboard man in a CGI room. For the past 18 or so years, we've been at a stage in cinema history where CGI can look pretty much photorealistic and work like any other tool when creating a film. And when it's used right, it can be truly magical. And I believe that Guardians of the Galaxy's CGI is almost seamlessly integrated into the physical shots of the movie. Rocket and Groot might as well have been there for real. The team did such a fantastic job at animating and breathing life into these two. I can't imagine how much effort went into those two characters alone, not even including the entire worlds, spaceships, nowhere, and all those little creatures running about. To call this movie a green screen fest would be a complete understatement and disservice to the film. They integrate the physical elements and green screens almost seamlessly. The only scene that looks kinda iffy is the scene where Quill sacrifices himself for Gamora. I mean, tell me that doesn't look like a PS3 cutscene. But other than that, this movie looks gorgeous. Also, how the hell are his hands not frozen? For better or for worse, Guardians of the Galaxy changed the MCU landscape. Its style, its humor, its emotional moments were all so pivotal in what MCU movies could become. Not to say that the movies before this fell short, but I would say that there's definitely a difference between those movies and the movies that came after Guardians. Some people dislike the effect that this movie had on the MCU afterwards, but honestly, whenever a movie comes out and it does well, all other movies try to copy it. It's just how Hollywood works. And just because the other movies fell short of being on Guardians' level, I don't think that Guardians 1 or James Gunn need to be held to blame for it. I love this movie and so many other people do as well. And these are only some of the reasons why.
My turn.
This one is my favorite. There, I said it.
I know that sounds bad.
Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is great, hands down, and feels like a very natural continuation of this story and the bond between these characters. Starting with the story, you gotta love how it follows up on those loose ends from the first, with the consequences of Yondu's choices and Peter being half celestial because of his father, who we meet in this. The film really taps into the wacky, unhinged potential of this corner in the Marvel Universe and uses that in multiple different facets. The opening set piece with the obelisk is very well choreographed with a great needle drop, and it does a great job setting up the inciting incident with the Sovereign that opens the door for the Ravagers and Ego. Oh, and how could I forget, Baby Groot, again, following up on details from before. He's funny, adorable, but at the same time doesn't overstay his welcome. He definitely feels like a test run of sorts for Baby Yoda, but not in a bad way. No! The praises I sang for the opening scene aren't exclusive though. Nearly every action scene is creative and drives the plot forward in some way or another. Rocket's fight with the Ravagers in the forest was hilarious, and the final battle, ironically enough, feels like a greatest hits compilation with everyone's skills on full display. And I have to talk about the escape scene with Yondu and Rocket. It was built up very well with good character moments and jokes, so when it finally happens and the music kicks in, it just rocks. Feeling like the arrow scene from the first movie just amped up to 11. It's one of my favorite fight scenes in the entire MCU. The music selection is just as good as the first one too. Mr. Blue Sky, The Chain, Come a Little Bit Closer, Wham Bam, Brandy You're a Fine Girl, and of course, Father and Son, which complements the scene it plays over very well. The humor is also really strong, with a lot of well-timed punchlines, slapstick moments, and running jokes that, at the very least, keep you entertained. At the same time, though, the film knows when to use comedy and when to hold back for serious moments, showing a respectable amount of restraint and understanding of the story Gunn had created. But the main things I want to talk about are the characters. With James Gunn at the helm once again, his signature style helps all of these obscure misfits get expanded upon in meaningful, creative ways. The new characters like Mantis are a great addition to the team, especially considering the development she'll get in the entries to come. She has some funny moments and her powers are unique, changing up fight scenes and also serving as a window to the emotional development of other characters, like Drax for example. The scene with the two outside Ego's palace was very well done and adds a new layer to Drax's personality that's typically covered up by his strongman antics. Towards the end of the film, he has a few more that do the same as well, and he really feels like a strong foundation on the team. Dave Bautista is a very underrated actor, and I'm glad at least some of his vast emotional range is shown here. Gamora and Nebula each get good moments solo, and the bond that these two sisters develop was pretty good too, with some of their arguments being very raw, which makes their eventual reconciliation that much more satisfying to watch. I will say, with this movie coming out around the time Marvel was gearing up for Infinity War, the nods to Thanos are appreciated as well, but I feel like the Adam Warlock teaser in the credits was supposed to set it up too, judging by the source material and the presentation, but we'll talk about that later. Star-Lord, of course, has great progression. Him clinging to a sense of family and then learning to let go of his father to embrace his new one was very captivating. Across all three of the main films, and also Infinity War, Peter has a solid arc of overcoming loss and loving the family you have, which is something very relatable to a lot of people around the world, and I find it deeply profound. Especially when your dad is Santa Claus.
Well, Santa Claus is back in town.
That's right, stirring up Peter's conflict is Ego, who's easily one of the better villains in the MCU. He has motives that are well explained, he's both charismatic and imposing, while simultaneously having good emotional moments too, where at times it seems like he does actually care for his son. The scenes with him and Peter are probably some of the best in the movie from the writing and chemistry alone. Kurt Russell is fantastic here with infectious, larger-than-life energy. All the performances are top-notch here. I feel that goes without saying, but Gunn really knows how to get 110% out of everyone on screen. This applies especially to the two standout characters, Yondu and Rocket Raccoon.
Don't call me a raccoon!
Yondu being kicked out of the Ravagers because of his genuine love for Peter and going on to be the father he ends up looking to the most was beautiful, and his sacrifice serves as a very heartfelt moment for the two, reinforcing the flashbacks Peter had when fighting Ego. As for Rocket, he has a lot of self-hatred regarding who he is and where he came from, which leads to him lashing out at anyone and everyone trying to care about him, and that affects the story too. It's very well done and covered with both humorous and serious moments, especially his argument with Yondu on the ship. In general, all the characters are great, and the story is obviously connected to them very tightly. They drive the story forward, not some invisible puppet master. Even the smaller and cameo characters are at least well acted and have a reason to be there, like Sylvester Stallone, and seeing Howard the Duck again is always a pleasure. This film, while not being perfect with some light pacing issues, is still a worthy sequel and holds up to the magic of the original. It's very apparent that this was made with a story in mind and not just a cash grab. 8 out of 10, great story, action, characters, humor, performances, music, whatever, just go watch it, what's next? Now you get some pretty easy ones, man, go enjoy yourself.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, what can you say about these guys in the Avengers?
If only you knew. Let's kick this off with Infinity War. Now, I could glaze this movie all day. It is one of my favorite movies ever. But given that this is just a review for the Guardians of the Galaxy, I'll try to restrain myself here. With all the different groups and characters in this movie, it might seem like the Guardians aren't as important as the mainline Avengers or even the Wakandans. I mean, the movie is titled Avengers Infinity War. It'd be easy to say they're the secondary or even tertiary group of the story. But in my opinion, they're much more important than that. I'd argue the Guardians are the glue that makes this film as great as it is. Why, you may ask? Think back, who is the main character of the movie? This has been largely agreed upon by the creators of Marvel, such as the screenwriters and the directors. It might not seem important who the main character is with such a large cast, but the fact they wrote the story around Thanos is vital to why this movie works so much. Thanos goes through an arc. He has flaws he has to overcome. We need a framework of his past in order to understand why he goes through this arc and why he goes up against the Avengers specifically. That's what the Guardians are for. Sure, Thanos could just show up in New York at the beginning and he meets with the Avengers then, but that would be very cookie cutter. Instead, we're given time to reflect on his character, his past, his motivations, his flaws. Thanos doesn't directly confront the mainline Avengers until an hour and 46 minutes into the movie. Yeah, he bumped into Thor and Hulk at the beginning, but they didn't pose any serious threat to him at the time. The heroes don't pose any real danger to him until they all meet on Titan. This is because the movie used the first hour and a half to establish who Thanos was as a character and his relationships. The Guardians act as both a narrative and emotional connection between Thanos and the rest of the heroes. It is through Gamora and Nebula we get to understand who Thanos is. It's through the Guardians that Thor and Iron Man fully grasp the situation at hand. For Infinity War, I'm going to talk specifically about Gamora and Star-Lord. I'll talk more about Nebula when I get to Endgame. The other members are great and are important to the plot, but they mostly act as comedic roles or an extra force against Thanos. Okay, so I'd argue Gamora is the second most important character in Infinity War. Sure, most of the cast play their parts in the story, but without Gamora, this movie doesn't work. Because she's the emotional heart of the film. We get to understand who Thanos is through Gamora. He's not a mustache-twirling villain. He's a very complicated character. Yes, he's tortured people and murdered trillions, but he's a loving father. A horrible, abusive father, no doubt. But the movie makes it explicitly clear that he loves Gamora. It pains him to see her in pain. He literally cries when he kills her. His god complex and arrogance should suggest the opposite, but this is what makes him a complicated and almost sympathetic character. Ironically, without his love for Gamora, Thanos would not have won. There is no way for him to know about the Soul Stone's rules or to steal the stone somehow. He had to sacrifice someone he loved, and probably the only thing he loved was Gamora. This concept alone turns Thanos from a generic villain to a surprisingly human character. Of course, it's not like Gamora is just a plot device to give Thanos the Soul Stone. Her entire arc has been moving on from the shadow and abuse of her father. One of the best scenes of the movie is seeing Thanos adopt Gamora. The entire scene is from her point of view. We see the amount of trauma and manipulation Thanos puts on her. In a sense, Gamora has always been that little girl, and she's tried to move past that her entire life. We see this in her relationship with Star-Lord. We see this as she reconciles with Nebula. The Guardians are Gamora's new family. The Milano is her new home. The tragedy of her story is that she was pulled back into her father's abuse. It finally looked like she moved on, especially as she embraced Quill on the ship. She was even willing to let Quill kill her before becoming a pawn for Thanos. But his grip was too strong for her, and through no fault of her own, it led to her death. That's why the Soul Stone scene tears me up, because there's so many complex emotions happening at the same time, both from the perspective of Thanos and Gamora.
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
And of course, we can't forget that amazing scene at the end of the movie.
What did it cost?
Everything.
This perfectly displays the dynamic between the two characters. We see how complicated relationships like these have drastic effects on the rest of society. This is symbolized through Peter Quill. Taffi and Max have already gone through the first two Guardians films, so I won't go too deeply on Quill's overall arc here. But given his past, it's important to note that Gamora is Peter's first healthy relationship since his mother's passing. It's because of Gamora that he begins to heal himself. So when she tells him that he needs to kill her if need be, Peter kind of brushes it off. It's still that point where all of the heroes feel it. But as we all know, this was a choice Peter was actually forced to make. The entire exchange between Peter, Gamora, and Thanos is what really sold me on this movie being different than the others. I seriously never considered Star-Lord would actually go through on his promise. It's a beautifully made scene. In a way, it's actually the reverse of Thanos' murder, because Peter and Gamora exchanged their love for each other, something she didn't do for Thanos. Here, Gamora's death would have been of her own volition. Now, Thanos taking Gamora was bad enough for Star-Lord, but hearing about her death?
No! God, please, no! No!
We're on the verge of greatness. We were this close to providing peace and security for the galaxy.
Okay, but as much as this scene drives all of us insane, trust me, I still get pissed to this day, it is definitely in line with Quill's character. Again, Gamora basically represents Star-Lord's journey. A life with her is exactly what Peter's been building up to. So, to have that taken away from him, it's too much for him. Looking back, it's a bit hard for me to be totally mad because I don't know how many of us would have the strength to resist punching Thanos. It's a very human decision, one I praise the writers for having the guts to pull off. Now, there's certainly a lot more I could dive into this movie pertaining to Guardians. I haven't even mentioned the great storyline with Thor, Rocket, and Groot. But we still have quite a few projects to go through, so let's move on to Avengers Endgame.
Again!
So I'm going to keep it a $150 here. I am not a big fan of this movie. Personally, I think there were a lot of weird decisions they made that don't entirely make sense. That being said, I think most of the stuff related to the Guardians is generally handled well. First, let me briefly mention what I didn't like before ending with the positives. I really don't like the fact they brought back Gamora. Obviously, it's not technically the same Gamora, but To me, it unnecessarily undoes that amazing scene in Infinity War. Now, they do handle this dynamic between Gamora and Peter beautifully in Guardians 3, but it doesn't change how I feel about Endgame's decision to bring back the character. Also, I'm a little annoyed that Peter's punch was never seriously addressed after Infinity War. I'm glad he took the blame in Guardians 3, but he should have received massive repercussions from the Avengers or people in the galaxy, not just a kick to the balls as a throwaway joke. A lot out of the way though, I really like Nebula's arc in this movie. I think Endgame really cements Nebula's role as a hero. We saw her journey to the light side throughout the first two Guardians films and Infinity War, but in Endgame, we finally see that transition to heroic status. She's no longer concerned with revenge or selfish interests. She's not part of something greater than herself. She cares for the well-being of others, and she wants justice for Thanos' actions. Much like how Gamora's arc was focused on moving past her trauma, Endgame focused on Nebula doing the exact same thing. Except this time, she actually got to see that happy ending. There are two scenes in particular I really liked. First was when Nebula and past Gamora team up. It's short, but it perfectly resembles Nebula's journey. Gamora always pushed her sister to be better. Nebula taking her sister's hand shows how far she's come to heal herself. This is followed up by the scene where Nebula kills her past self. The obvious symbolism is that she finally killed her old nature. The part of her that couldn't move on from Thanos. The part of her that wasn't willing to change. Again, this shows why Gamora is so important to the story, even if I'm not a fan of how they utilized her in Endgame. By the way, in the original version of Infinity War, Nebula actually controlled the Infinity Gauntlet for a bit. She becomes the main villain of the story after she stole the gauntlet from Thanos. I thought that was pretty cool. Now, the other surviving member of the Guardians was Rocket. While him seeing Groot get dusted was one of the saddest scenes in Infinity War, there's really not much I can say about him in Endgame. Not to say he was handled poorly or anything, I just think they were waiting for Guardians 3 to let his character cook. There's really not much more to say about the other Guardian members in Endgame. I think it's a bit strange that Drax wasn't given more to do given Thanos killed his family. But the writers had enough characters to deal with, and I think him just being there in the battle is enough for me. Again, while the actual characters in the Guardians may not have the most screen time or the most surface level importance, they're the glue that makes these stories work. Because it's through them we really get to understand Thanos' character and the emotional stakes of the story. I doubt Infinity War would have had the impact it had if Thanos only confronted the Avengers, who he hasn't directly confronted until that movie. The fact we already knew the relationship with his daughters going into Infinity War gave us the personal touch needed for a universe-breaking story. Before Max talks about the final film of the Guardians trilogy, there was another appearance the crew showed up in.
Get out of my house!
No, not that appearance. I still have PTSD from that movie. If this weren't a Guardians review, I'd rant about Thor Love and Thunder all day long. No, I'm talking about the Guardians holiday special. Personally, I really enjoyed the Guardians holiday special. I like how the entire plot of this movie is the product of a running joke that Star-Lord is obsessed with Kevin Bacon.
The Avengers, the Earth's mightiest heroes.
Like Kevin Bacon?
He may be on the team, I don't know, I haven't been there in a while.
Exactly like Footloose. Is it still the greatest movie in history?
It never was.
What I especially appreciate about this movie is how it develops Mantis' character. Up until now, she's been a pretty one-dimensional character. Not a bad one by any means, but she's pretty much been relegated as a fish out of water sidekick. But in the holiday special, she's the main character. We find out that Mantis is actually Star-Lord's half-sister. However, she doesn't want to tell him this because she worries she'll be a constant reminder of his father ego. Given all that Peter has gone through, especially with the recent death of Gamora, this is entirely understandable. Still wanting to lift up his spirits, she decides the best plan is to kidnap Kevin Bacon. Gee, I wonder what's wrong with that plan.
And nothing can go wrong.
Most of what follows is a bunch of goofy antics and silly jokes. I love Kevin Bacon in this. You can just tell he's having so much fun. Yeah, so obviously the plan goes poorly.
This isn't a Christmas gift. This is human trafficking. Yes.
Oh no, it all went wrong.
Man, I love the comedy in this movie. Anyways, after everyone reconciles, we get a great scene between Mantis and Peter. She finally tells him she's his sister. The acting is great here. You can really see just how scared she is to admit the truth. This exchange is really the heart of the story for me. I know the holiday special has a pretty basic plot, but it provided one of my favorite moments from this series. The hug Peter and Mantis give, plus everyone exchanging gifts, is so heartfelt. I love that Rocket actually got Bucky's arm as a gift. Sometimes, simple is better. I think the holiday special is what the Guardians needed right before the final installment in the MCU. I think it finally pushes them to that level required for the maturity of Guardians 3. Not that they didn't receive that in the Avengers movies, but the holiday special rounds out the relationships and arcs all the characters have been going through. It makes the final goodbye in Guardians 3 so much sadder. Also, I love the final nod to Yondu. He was a great character, and I appreciate that they gave him one final scene to show his love for Peter. Since the Guardians holiday special was released on Disney+, I think it went a bit under the radar. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you do. There's some great comedy, especially when it comes to Kevin Bacon, and cool pieces of lore sprinkled throughout. But now, let's move on to Guardians of the Galaxy 3.
Wow, even after the Endgame, the story of these characters continues to be told very well, but all stories have to end somewhere, and the Guardians of the Galaxy are no different. I know I said that Volume 2 was my favorite in the series, but it has come very close to being dethroned several times by this one. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is the best possible conclusion to the story of these characters and a fantastic film in its own right. Before I worship the things I like, though, I'll start with a few setbacks present here. I find the characters of Adam Warlock and Gamora to be a bit weak, and as if they could have been implemented better, but that isn't James Gunn's fault.
Please, James Gunn, sit on me.
I mentioned earlier that Adam Warlock's teaser scene was probably supposed to be important for Infinity War, judging from how much he's involved in the Infinity books, but as we know, he never showed up, so his debut got pushed back to this. I like the detail that he was born premature, causing him to act more childish than he should, but otherwise he seems kind of tacked on for the first half or so. That being said, he still has some good jokes, and by the end he gets redeemed in a rather sentimental way, so it wasn't all bad by any means.
Don't be rash.
Speaking of Infinity War, Gamora is still in the series. She's also a bit weird because I don't really think she was supposed to be here under these circumstances. Her being killed and then replaced with a younger version from the past doesn't entirely seem like something Gunn planned for. In fact, she was originally supposed to die at the end of Volume 2, which would have been interesting. Nevertheless, she helps Peter let go of her death, and she has some nice moments with the other characters that for the most part justify her being here. I really have to give Gunn credit for being able to salvage and work around the material Marvel left him with, like Adam and Gamora, plus smaller details like Star-Lord's mask, which was supposed to be destroyed in Volume 2, but showed back up in Infinity War. Keeping with the good stuff, everything I said about the second movie is still applicable and arguably better. The cinematography is on point. Some of these shots look drop-dead gorgeous, especially when there's subjects in the shot that are cool to look at, thanks to the amazing effects, makeup, sets, and costumes. The performances are somehow better than the last film, with Chris Pratt, Bradley Cooper, and Jaquudi Awiji being the standouts in my opinion. The music is still very good, No Sleep Till Brooklyn, Creep, Crazy on You, and two others that I will discuss later. The pacing is great. For having a 2 hour and 30 minute runtime, it doesn't feel like it wastes your time at all. The film allocates just the right amount of time for you to process what happens and then move on to the next scene. The action is awesome, even if there aren't really many fight scenes in total. I know the most talked about one is probably the one take towards the end, and rightfully so, but Peter and Groot's showdown in the evolutionary ship was the standout for me.
It's not a trap, it's a face-off.
The comedy is still great, and used appropriately. I'm happy the MCU is finally starting to grow up and challenge the audience a bit more because that F-bomb killed me and my family in the theater.
Okay. Now what?
Open the fuck.
Speaking of growing up with the audience, the movie can also get very somber and at times outright disturbing, but at the same time it's also chock-a-block full of the same fun, weird energy from the previous entries. Said disturbing tone comes from the antagonist, the High Evolutionary. Where Ego, Thanos, and the Collector all had likable traits to some extent, he borrows more out of Ronin's page where he's just evil, but it's amplified by a top-tier performance and more context from Rocket's backstory to make him so utterly detestable. He creates a major sense of urgency despite not directly confronting the Guardians until about a third into the movie. On top of this, we also get to see what he's capable of, not just in terms of invasions or superpowers, but also infliction of emotional trauma, which makes his presence all the more powerful and the triumph against his literal god complex all the more satisfying. As for the rest of the characters, the film expertly wraps up everyone's stories and gives them perfect send-offs, besides Gamora. Mantis continues to prove her worth in spades, with her greatest strength being her empathy and ability to care for not just her half-brother or family, but also space creatures that Drax and Nebula were ready to just run from. Speaking of, Nebula's growth has been very fulfilling to watch across all of these projects, and now that she's moved past her Thanos-related trauma, she becomes more of a team player, and we see that in her bonds with the rest of the team, especially Rocket. As a reminder, those two in specific spent 5 more years together than the rest during Endgame, and that gets acknowledged in small, clever ways.
And he's okay.
Drax continues to be both funny and wise, and his moment with the young test subjects was very touching. Peter's story was very sweet, finally accepting that the Gamora he loved is gone and moving on in life, and holding the team together to save Rocket, who, in case there was any need for clarification, is the best character, once again, by a long shot. He was born into the world scared and in pain that was relieved by the love of the people around him, only for those loved ones to be gunned down by the same people who revealed that he was created for nothing more than to be a stepping stone for another, superior species. Everything Rocket has done up to this point is explained through this backstory. His self-hatred, bad decisions, and his treatment of those who get close to him.
Why didn't ask to get made?
Years of this internal torment to the point where he's ready to give up, only to say,
I'm done running.
And proves to himself that he is loved and capable of so much, no matter who created him or why. It's the best arc in the movie and probably one of the best in the MCU. The cameo characters are also nice. Ben Davis and Nathan Fillion were funny, especially if you know some of the behind-the-scenes stuff regarding Fillion.
Thought you said something else. Shut up.
And the appearance of Yondu is of course great, appropriately used to elevate Kraglin instead of being nostalgia bait. As said previously, every character gets an amazing conclusion that tugs on the heartstrings, with the brilliant part being that no one dies. There were some close calls, for sure. Some others may have cried, but regardless, every one of these misfits gets a happy ending, including the director. For those of you who didn't know, these movies and characters were deeply close to James Gunn, with him associating most closely with Rocket, and by the time he was working on this film, he was gearing up to take over as CEO of DC Studios, meaning this was effectively the end. So before moving on to new things, how about one last adventure before hitting the lights on the way out? Dog Days is possibly one of the best scenes in the MCU to date. Everyone having a celebration of how far they've come before taking the next big step in their lives. I mean, Drax finally dances and Peter reunites with his grandfather. How much better can it get? The Dog Days are literally over for the Guardians and James, and I couldn't have come up with a better way to cap it all off. Oh, except for maybe this.
Oh, this one's kind of special.
It ends the same way it started nearly a decade later. That sums it up pretty well, I'd say. Alright, this is your neck of the woods. Go nuts.
Did you just bring me into this because I talk about animation and not for my actual ability to analyze media for its themes and meanings?
A little bit.
Okay then. Hey again. Although I said the Guardians of the Galaxy were one of the less popular teams in Marvel before the movie came out, the team did go through a small renaissance in the mid-2000s with an event in the comics called Annihilation, where they gained a small cult fanbase, possibly because this was one of the first times that this version of the team was put together. Previously, there were some other recognizable names in the group like Yondu and Jim Valentino's run, but Rocket, Groot, Gamora? Nope. So for the cartoon appearances, we actually get to see a few cartoon adaptations of the Guardians before the MCU's influence. In Lionsgate's Planet Hulk movie, in a gladiator match, we get to see Star-Lord in the crowd cheering on. I love this design since it's based on the Annihilation storyline's art style. So he has the helmet with the gas mask look underneath, and has that British soldier influence that the artist was going for. But we don't actually get to see him talk or do anything other than this default crowd cheering animation. And the other Guardians just aren't there. We don't get to see a full group appearance until the Guardians appear in Season 2, episode 6 of Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. Earth's Mightiest Heroes was a slightly more comic accurate adaptation of the Avengers and the Marvel Universe, with the original team being more similar to the comics and the movies, the designs being less espionage and spy-like, but more campy and comic accurate, and the characters' personalities are slightly more derivative of the comics, such as Thor, who became almost completely different in the movies compared to the comics, as the MCU eventually took a more comedic angle to the character. In this episode, the Guardians are sent to retrieve Michael Korvac, a man who was abducted by the Kree but escaped and sought refuge with the Avengers. The episode is one of those classic stories where the two parties don't realize that they're both good guys yet and clash at first. This miscommunication begins when the Guardians don't arrive speaking English, which is something I liked in comparison to the MCU, where everyone else and Groot just speaks English as a default universal language for simplicity's sake. Rocket is the first to speak out of the bunch, and I was pretty shocked to hear him speak with an Australian accent, but I must say it did suit him. The Guardians only start speaking English using Warlock's Soulstone to explain their motives after getting beaten up by the Avengers, revealing that Korvac is actually a danger to everyone and that he needs to be properly detained. The Guardians in this episode are almost the full team we know and love today. Gamora and Drax aren't there, but we have fan favourite characters like Adam Warlock and Quasar in their place. Although Rocket is pretty much the same old wisecracking self, Peter Quill is a very different character from his early adaptations in the MCU, as he's portrayed as a much more stoic and respectable leader. The episode doesn't have too much exposition or character building for the Guardians, but they still are presented like a family, just not the exact same family we're currently used to. The animation in this episode is really good, the fight scenes are exciting, the pacing is great, and I also love the character designs for the Guardians themselves and the Avengers. I mean, look at Hawkeye, he's got the little thing. Ironically, this series was cancelled so that a new lineup of animated shows that had a more similar style and story to the MCU could be released. But because the first Guardians movie hadn't been announced yet, in their next Marvel cartoon appearance, they still have a much more comic accurate look. The Guardians were introduced to this new universe, which I call the MDTVU, in Season 2 Episode 17 of Ultimate Spider-Man. This episode was written by Brian Michael Bendis, who wrote the Ultimate Spider-Man book and many other big Marvel comic titles. However, other than that, this episode isn't special at all other than expanding the world of the MDTVU. In this series, Spider-Man has a team, and one of his teammates, Nova, gets him and Spider-Man dragged into a space battle alongside the Guardians to stop the Earth from being destroyed. The Guardians aren't really given too much personality other than Rocket Raccoon, who's presented as Nova's mentor. In this episode, the Guardians consist of the same team that we get to see in the first movie, but again with more comic accurate designs. So I'm assuming that Guardians of the Galaxy 1 was in development, so the showrunners of Ultimate Spider-Man at least knew which characters to put in the episode to synergize with the movie. Other than Rocket, the other Guardians kinda just fight and glaze Nova, who previously in the series was kind of a prick to Spider-Man the whole time. So in context, it's a little surprising to see Nova get treated like he's not an idiot. At the end of the episode, Nova's willing to sacrifice himself for the planet when a giant laser is shot at it. He survives and the Guardians ask for him to rejoin them, and he kinda just goes, okay, and just goes away with them. Spider-Man regroups with his team on Earth and tells them how Nova's gone and about his shockingly heroic actions, only for Nova to return 5 seconds later because I guess the show's afraid of commitment. But this episode was pretty average since the Guardians were introduced on a surface level, kind of like in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, but the action wasn't as exciting, and instead of us getting the Guardians to give proper exposition through dialogue, Nova just explained their abilities and personalities over title cards, which is low-key a staple of the show.
What is that?
The Guardians make cameos in the MDTVU in Season 1 Episode 22 of Avengers Assemble and Season 2 Episode 5 of Hulk Agents of Smash. They're pretty much the same as how they appear in Ultimate Spider-Man, but after the massive success that Guardians 1 got, Disney greenlit a Guardians of the Galaxy animated series inspired by the movie. And when I say inspired, I mean it's basically a continuation of it. The designs are almost one-for-one copies of the movies, and the voice actors do slightly exaggerated impressions of the actors in the movie. I'd say the best voice in this show is probably Gamora's, since she weirdly sounds more true to the character than Zoe Saldana did in the first movie. Wait, put down your pitchforks, let me talk. For a child of Thanos who is supposed to be the most skilled and controlled assassin in the galaxy, I like how she's more stoic and low-key, and it adds a sort of nobility to her. This isn't to say that I dislike Zoe Saldana's performance, but I think she was a bit too loud, if that makes sense, and I just prefer this version a tiny bit more. From what I've seen, Star-Lord seems to have his element gun from the comics instead of his stun gun / laser pistol that he had in the movie, but he acts and sounds almost exactly like Chris Pratt's version, which kinda sucks voice-wise since Will Friedle voices him in this show, and as one of my favorite voice actors in the world, it hurts me to say that this performance wasn't very strong. He basically does the same voice he did for Deadpool and Ultimate Spider-Man, but slightly more grounded. Groot and Rocket are pretty much the same as their movie counterparts, but Drax slightly tones down the comedic side of his character. I'm not too happy with how Yondu came out in this show because James Arnold Taylor does a pretty pretty stinky Michael Rooker impression when voicing him, as he doesn't really get the accent right. But in terms of writing, I don't have many issues with Yondu. It's just every time he walks on screen, I just dread to hear him speak. After watching a few episodes of this show, I think I can confidently say that I believe this is the best show in the MDTVU. Not like that's saying too much, but it's something. There are no schizo fourth wall breaks that mess up with the episode's flow like in Ultimate Spider-Man. A high majority of the characters are likable in their own right without being flat like in Avengers Assemble, and the animation is pretty good looking and has cool shading and backgrounds. This is a solid action cartoon, not always amazing, but it has its moments. I never watched it when I was younger, probably because I was turned off from these shows by Avengers Assemble and Hulk Agents of Smash. But I only continued to watch Ultimate Spider-Man because A, there were moments that were genuinely good, and B, Spider-Man was my childhood favorite character of all time, like most other children, so I was heavily biased. This show is still flawed to quite a large degree in my opinion, mainly because I think it could benefit from trying to be less of a carbon copy of the movies and more original to the showrunners. Like the first 2 episodes are a loose adaptation of the first movie's plot, where in the cartoon, the Crypto Cube is essentially the orb MacGuffin that contained the Power Stone, and pretty much all the characters that appeared in Guardian 1 show up here as well. But there are some cool deviations, like the MacGuffin being a map leading to a cool space odyssey where we can meet more Guardian side characters and villains, and also Peter Quill is the only one who can open it due to his half-alien side. So if you are looking for some more Guardians of the Galaxy content in a similar style to the MCU movies, this show can definitely satisfy that desire. The Guardians also make a fair share of appearances in What If, however I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm the biggest fan of that show. It had a few decent episodes, one of the funniest being the What If T'Challa got abducted instead of Peter Quill episode. Then there's a couple episodes in season 2 that also cover the Guardians. And as an alternate timeline anthology series, it's definitely refreshing to see different takes on the team every once in a while. However, I'd still much rather watch the movies or some of the other cartoons on this list. To be honest, the Guardians had a few more cartoon appearances than I had expected. Going into this, I assumed that they would only appear in Ultimate Spider-Man and the Disney XD show, but there are a good few other guest appearances that they made in other Marvel shows from the early 2010s, and a shocking Star-Lord cameo in the Marvel Lionsgate universe. Whilst the pre-MCU Guardians have scarce on-screen adaptations, there's still an ample amount so you can at least get the gist of what they were once like. And as for post-MCU, I can confidently say there's a great amount of cartoons to keep you busy.
You shut up!
So guys, we did it. All of these awesome projects looked back on as one cohesive, intelligent, and emotional story. I still find it funny how some of the best Marvel movies ever made don't even have a single superhero in them. On top of that, they serve as a lesson to Marvel to let the creatives at the helm flesh out their vision. Now yes, sometimes those creatives get a little bit too much control, but more often than not, there are people with talent, passion, and skill behind these things that get suppressed, resulting in projects that just aren't as good as they could be. Not James though. He fought tooth and nail, getting fired and rehired to complete this journey, and for how personal it was, it still spoke to so many people, and that isn't just movie magic right there, it's a wonderful example of human empathy. And with that, we've reached the end of this giant project. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I hope you found it entertaining and informative. Be sure to like and subscribe to Taffi's World, Enter the Speed Force, and me if you're feeling generous. Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, and I'll see you nerds later.
Tell me why it ain't nothing but a holiday. Tell me why it ain't nothing but a mistake. Tell me why I never wanna hear you say I want it bad.